Okay, back again here, and this is probably going to be the last of the lectures for the year. I don't know if I'll have to do some fill-in for some things that maybe need some clarification, or maybe that I skipped over a little bit too much in the process. But I've already given you the three of the questions that you'll have in your final, the two revolving the Middle Ages, and then the development of modern Europe. And then I gave you the one about the impact of discovery on Europe, then Africa, Asia, the Americas. The last one is going to simply be on Western thought. And when we say Western thought, that is the main ideas of Western Europe, the Americas, primarily. So when you say Western thought, it is distinguished from Buddhism or Hinduism or Confucianism, or even to a certain extent Islam. So the question would then be, is trace Western thought 1350 to 1750? Okay, that's more or less going to be the question, that period, Renaissance through the Enlightenment. Again, if there's questions on that, we can clarify that later on. Okay, the two things here today is to emphasize is prior to 1492, you had a world of isolated cultures. That is, there was a vague awareness at some levels about China in England, but nothing of a specific nature. There was a vague knowledge about the Spice Islands in Spain, but nothing of a specific nature. There was an awareness as time went on, particularly after Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca, about sub-Saharan Africa. But then these entities didn't necessarily have much to know about Western Europe either, or the Middle East. In fact, that was one of the reasons Mansa Musa took his pilgrimage, was to find out about the rest of the world. So you had these isolated cultures, and of course, you had the Native American cultures that nobody had any idea existed. And what 1492 began was the process of globalization. Okay, we're still going through that 500 years later, 500 plus years later. Nonetheless, after, more so even than the Portuguese discoveries, because what they did is clarify pretty much what was already known. What Columbus unleashed was a globalization process and awareness that, yes, the world was round, and man, is it a lot bigger than we thought it was. And in the long run, the most significant thing about this is what is called the Columbian Exchange. And it's the, in simple terms, the transfer of plants, animals, culture, populations, technology between the Americas, often known as the New World, and the Old World. That process continues today, but it was really the 15 and 1600s that saw that evolution. Now, I'm not sure if I really talked about this before. America. Well, why America, and why not Columbia? The simple reason is Columbus went to his grave believing that he was in India. Amerigo Vespucci, who went with Columbus on his third voyage, drew up a map of the Caribbean, and he also combined that map with John Cabot's maps and some other, and the Verrazano, the other explorers, and he put the coastline together, and then he compared it to the coastline of China as described by Marco Polo, and he said, I don't know where we are, but we're not in China. We are in a new world. And then at the bottom of it, he signed it Amerigo. His map, when he got back, went to a printer. The printer left his name Amerigo down there at the bottom, and thus the New World, the Americas, became America and not Columbia. Just a kind of a small sidelight there. He has to settle for Columbus, Ohio. So, and here he has some graphic pictures of the Columbian Exchange. What I'll go down to is a less colorful, but a little more forthright. All right, this is the transfer. This is what we're talking about with the Columbian Exchange. Transfer of native organisms from one part of the world to the other. And these are all the things that came from the old world that became, and we take them for granted. Things like the domestic goose, which you would think would have been here beforehand, was not. The horse as well. So, on the other hand, not nearly so many American animals transferred. The alpaca, the llama, guinea pig, the mink, probably the most common would be the turkey. But the big change here is in the vegetarian realm. And all of these products are old world products. But pepper, which had been one of the reasons why Columbus sailed, was found to have very fertile ground here in the Americas, and it broke the monopoly of the East Indies. And it's one of the reasons why this once upon a time very expensive product is now a very cheap one in it. But when you go over here to this side, these are very big changes. The old world to the new. The new world to the old. Big one right here, maize, which is a major product throughout the world. And just some simple things, peanuts, pecans, but also the potato, pumpkin, sweet potatoes, all of those things contributed to the demise, or not the demise, the lessening of famine. As the crop variety increased and the stability or the harvest increased, starvation became less and less of a case factor, evidenced by the fact it took until 1850 for the Earth to get to 1 billion people in terms of population. Today it's almost 8 billion. So this transference of from the old world to the new and the new to the old produced tremendous increases in harvest and tremendous decrease in starvation. Not that there isn't starvation in the world today. And this is the real problem here, is the plagues that were brought. These are old world diseases, never present in the new world, and it contributed to that demise of the Native American population, and really had tremendous long-term historical effect. So those are the charts. Here's some other down here, a little more colorful graphics. Here it shows the New World products going over here, and then the Old World products coming this way. The diseases there being at the end area. And there's a couple other big, very colorful graphs. Trying to see if I can find anything of more that would add more to it. Yeah, so it's kind of a fanciful version of it. But I think you get the picture here, that this Columbian Exchange significant to a very large degree in terms of world history. And what we'll go to next is we'll talk about mercantilism. Okay, and as the European powers came to the Americas, they came for economic gain. And when we talk about mercantilism, we'll get into that specifically. But mercantilism was the economic motivation for colonization, and then we'll get into the definition of it real quickly here. The other rationalization for Europeans to come in and take the land claim it for themselves, where it had already been occupied. Disease did the most of the work for them. Again, without disease, I think the history of the world is going to be significantly different. The European takeover isn't going to happen. There's going to be some sort of, I won't say compromise, but some kind of melding of cultures that would result in kind of different approaches or different outcomes than we had today. But that is not to be, is the case. But the other motivation, the other justification was religion. That bringing Christianity, and Christianity, like Islam, is an evangelical religion, meaning you're looking for converts, you're looking to change people's view to your own. And with the European expansion, Christianity spread very rapidly, mostly Catholic because of the Spanish influence, but as we talked in the last lecture, the Protestantism of the United States is due to the English settlement after their Protestant Reformation occurred, and then the internal conflicts they had within. But as I said, all of these voyages were not little adventures. They were businesses. They were joint stock companies that were put together to raise capital and to turn out a profit. And the underlying concept of this was mercantilism. The idea of mercantilism was you wanted colonies for resources. So I'll go back here to the board. Mercantile was colonies, resources. And secondly, these same colonies were markets. And this is where you get the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Now, I'm going to mention the industrialization at the end of this lecture again in passing. That's clearly into the modern era. But the reason for colonies was to get the resources. Now, in the case of Spain, that was gold and silver. As you saw with the Columbian Exchange, it came to be the exchange of plants, animals, people, etc. But once you acquired the resources, those resources were turned into manufactured products, and the colonies became the place where you sold them. And the way the colonial situation operated during the mercantile period, you were only legally allowed to trade with the founding country. So the Spanish were not legally, the Spanish colonies were not legally allowed to trade with the British colonies, and vice versa. They were supposed to trade only with the mother country, and that was more or less enforced, though again, smuggling was rampant because you didn't have very rapid communication, much easier to get away with the crime, and the Americas became very, very adept at smuggling. So that was the goal here, okay, is to use colonies for resources and for markets. Number two, what you wanted was the net result of all this was to acquire more gold. Now, gold had been always a high price, not necessarily a high price, the standard for monetary gain, wealth, etc. And so what the mercantile theory became to be was a means for acquiring gold. Now, in this thing, Spain kind of blew it. They had all the gold and silver mines, but they basically went out and spent it all on manufactured goods produced by other countries. And thus, they were kind of like a middleman. The gold went from the Americas to the Spanish, and from the Spanish to the other European manufacturers. And they kind of really never figured out that they had to establish their own industries in order to retain this acquisition of gold. And then 3, he wanted a favorable balance of payments. This was the way by which you acquired more gold. What favorable balance of payments means is that you export more than you import. Okay, that was the goal of every colony in the mercantile arrangement. The trouble with this is everybody can't do it. It's a zero-sum game. Some countries are going to export more, and other countries are going to import more. And thus, this desire here to maintain a favorable balance of payment results in warfare over the acquisition of colonies. Okay, now this takes a while to develop, but you can see it's an inevitable development that everybody can't have a favorable balance of trade in the world. And governments developed strategies. They banned trade between colonies, restricted trade to only the mother countries, and of course the other thing they did was institute tariffs, which are a tax on imported goods. And if the tax on imported goods made the imported goods more expensive, then they didn't get imported to such a large degree. So you really had trade wars going on, but you ended up with real wars as well, and we'll go through those by the end of the period here with that. But the mercantile theory held sway for much of the colonial period, 1500 through 1800. And here you have some of these other things. Forbidding colonies to trade with other nations, monopolizing markets, banning the export of gold and silver even for payments, forbidding trade carried in foreign ships, subsidies on exports. You know, it's the problem we have today with subsidized steel from Korea, Japan, China, etc. You had government promotion of research for improved products or even direct subsidies. Here's another side of it: limiting the wages of workers, therefore making your products less expensive, using domestic resources, and restricting consumption of foreign goods. Again, pretty much summarized up in these things, but these 3 principles up here. But here you have this kind of a situation. And what they had, and it was called a protective tariff. Protective tariff. What was protected? Your own industries. You taxed the foreign goods to the point where they're more expensive than your domestic-made goods of the same type. Now, just in the modern world, it's kind of be interesting in the next few years, but the United States is the largest exporter of goods in the world, number 1 by far. But we are also the number 1 importer of goods, and we have a negative balance of payments. We import more than we export, mostly oil and mostly automobiles, electronics, a distant third, etc. Why don't we have protective tariffs? Simply because if we did that, then our exports would suffer as a result of it. And just in numerical terms, the U.S. GDP is around 19 trillion. Okay, that's a lot of money, an unimaginable amount of money. Our balance of trade is a negative 500 billion, which is, again, an astronomical amount of money. But after all is said and done, our GDP is 18.5 trillion. So while it would be better if there were a favorable or a break-even balance of trade, the U.S. economy is not going to go into tank at this point because of excess imports, etc. But again, those kinds of things take a while. To accomplish this, the colonial powers had to figure out how to make it work. Okay, here's one of those interactive maps showing the various countries over time and their interest. Whoops, I don't have it on the computer. Okay, I'll let that go. Let you just take a look at that. Okay, so you can see over time, the nature of who colonized the Americas changed significantly, and a number of powers were involved in it. Now, the major colonial powers, of course, Spain, Portugal primarily in Brazil, I think maybe even almost exclusively Brazil, Great Britain, France, but there were a number of other colonizing entities, the Dutch, the Swedes, the Danes. I won't put Denmark in there because it didn't have much of an impact there. And the one that's most surprising here is Russia. And I'll talk about each of these individually here. Now, again, these countries had colonies not for fame, but for fortune. It was an economic philosophy, the mercantile economic philosophy. And so they all had claims, and they all needed to turn those colonies into profit-making endeavors. Now, here's the early stages here. These are the Spanish colonies here, and then here's Portugal, and then you see there's little Portuguese colonies all over the world there. In the old world, Spain being mostly the New World Empire. And so we talked about the Columbian Exchange. The Spanish and the Portuguese, because of the issue with disease and the Native American population dying off, suffered a complete decline in labor that would turn these into profitable endeavors. So what Spain and mostly Portugal, more than any other country, turned to the African slave labor trade, which we talked about previously in one of the prior lectures. And again, the reason for it was they needed a workforce for the mines, for the fields, etc. And to the tune here of, well, I guess we have to include all of these, to the tune of 14 million people were used to enforce that mercantile theory. So you have an economic theory, but slavery is the real world consequence. Slavery plus the diseases that came with it, and that becomes the real world consequence that goes on. And again, Portugal and Spain primarily. The British colonies of North America, about 700,000. The French, a good deal less than that, mostly in Louisiana and in Haiti, which has an unfortunate end there. The Dutch used some slave labor in New York. It was New Amsterdam. The Swedes, I don't know, were involved in it, nor were the Russians. The big threat for the Russians, as you saw from that map, is they came from the other direction. They came from east to west, not west. Actually, it came from the Pacific side to the American side. From the Russian side, they came from the opposite direction. They came westward to the Americas, whereas the other voyages of discovery came from Europe, from the east to the Americas. And they laid claim to everything from Alaska all the way down to San Francisco Bay, and represented, until the 19th century, a real threat in terms of colonization. But due to their own internal problems, that never materialized. Okay, and here's the definition here. The Atlantic slave trade, or the transatlantic trade, crossed the Atlantic Ocean between the 15th and 19th centuries. That would be the 1400s. It's really the 1600s to the early 19th century that was the heyday of it. And it was a triangular trade. And again, this was considered to be a legitimate, normal business. So, yeah, there's what I'm looking for right here. And this is the way the triangular trade worked. You would put together a group of investors here, be it in England or France or Spain or the Netherlands, and they would take manufactured items down here to the coastal regions of Western Africa. There, they would trade those manufactured products, guns, knives, copper pots, etc. Now, the Africans had their own steel pots, but the goods that Europeans made were cheaper and therefore easier to trade and more plentiful, etc. And in exchange, those savannah kingdoms would have raided here in the interior and brought captured non-tribal members, non-kingdom members to the coast, where they would trade them for the manufactured goods, kind of offsetting the fact that they were starting to be bypassed by the coastal trade going around and no longer going through the savannah areas, which they had dominated for hundreds of years. Now, this is the most infamous part of the Atlantic slave trade, and this is called the Middle Passage. The first passage being from the interior of Africa to the coast, and then you had this middle passage where you went from Africa to the Americas. Generally, the destination was here in the islands, and the reason the destination is the islands, well, I take that back. It was the islands unless you were going to Brazil. From Brazil, it was just a straight shot across here, unless the Portuguese were going to engage in trade up here with the Spanish and perhaps the British and the French. But the Middle Passage is really where the slave trade becomes grotesque, because in the name of profit, as many people as possible were crammed into a voyage that could take as long as a month in there. And again, they were in conditions where they were not at large, they were chained, because now you're outnumbered. Slaves, potential slaves now outnumber you by a huge factor, so you're always worried about getting killed. And there are recorded examples of slave rebellions on ships. There's also recorded instances of whole groups of people jumping off the ship and committing suicide rather than going all the way across the ocean. At any rate, the death rate, because of the cramped conditions, and then because they didn't clean the ships, malaria and yellow fever flourished in the tropics. And not only did people destined for slavery die, the death rate among the crew members was extremely high. So while it was a business, it was a gross grotesque kind of business, and it also was one that was not terribly efficiently pulled off. Nonetheless, you end up with 14 million Africans in the Americas, and that's part of the Columbian Exchange as well. It's not discussed that way, but that African diaspora and this Middle Passage are part and parcel of that. Once you got to the islands, now there's a complex process by which you are taught a new language, because if you don't understand a particular language, you're not going to be able to carry out the work that necessarily needs to be done. And then the third part of the triangular trade is the products that were made here in the Americas then were shipped back to England. This is or to Europe, and this was part of the mercantile theory, was that the colonies were to produce products, and then you were to take those resources, and then you were to manufacture those products, put them into trade, and you had this vicious circle that went on for over 300 years. And again, it's no exaggeration to say it's the Microsoft of its day. It's the big business that goes on. And then this is a different diagram here. Slaves to the Americas, sugar, and going to New England, and then the sugar being turned into rum, and then that's sent back to Africa to trade for slaves. So the triangular trade and the Atlantic slave trade just dominates for about 300 years, and it is the solution to the labor shortage that occurs. One of the great ironies is, if you recall from the last lecture, 1619, what happened in Virginia? I'm sure you all know, the House of Burgesses. And the Burgesses were the burghers, the people from the towns that voted for representation, that would vote to tax themselves, etc. Now, Virginia and the Americas in general, they dealt with their labor problem a little bit differently, is that they used indentured servants. And indentured servants were people that served for a period of time, 3, 5, 7 years. Usually the person who owned the indenture, he didn't own the person, but he owned the indenture, was in jail for not paying debts. So the holder of the indenture would pay off the debt, and then that person would be bound to him for a period of years, and basically work in a slave-like condition, but it was over in 3, 5, or 7 years. And generally, if it was a female indenture, that ended even sooner than that, as there was always like a 9-to-1 male-female ratio in the American colonies for a long period of time. So you had indentures. Well, a Dutch ship shows up. It got blown off course in a hurricane, shows up at Jamestown, and they have 19 Africans who had been captured by the Dutch, and they needed supplies. They needed water and supplies, so they exchanged their 19 people that they had on board and left with the provisions that the people of Jamestown traded with them. The interesting thing is these first African slaves here assumed the status of indentured servant. That is, they were kept in bondage for a period of time, and then they basically got a severance pay. So, some clothes, a few bucks, and maybe even a small bit of land that went with it. The reason for this, and this is a very interesting story, and I teach U.S. history, I explore this a lot more, is that slavery was illegal in England. Okay, in fact, there's a famous case, the Somerset case of 1773, where a Virginian took his slave to London, and then when it was time to go home, Somerset, the slave's name, said, "No, I'm not going, because there's no slavery in England." The case went to court, and the judge ruled exactly that. And all of the colonists basically knew this. But again, why was a blind eye turned into this indentured servitude that eventually became slavery? And the answer is simple, is that it's profit. that the colonies were founded on the basis of turning out a profit, and eventually, and I'm not going to go through the details of the process, the African indentured servants by 1676, following Bacon's rebellion, which included a lot of former indentures, both African and European. And what was adopted was a variation on the Barbados codes. Okay? Okay, the Barbados codes, and there's a lot more to them, very harsh, very strict, but what it did was it made African slavery permanent, and slaves were considered to be chattel, which is a legal term for property. So that was the case then, and it passed on from generation to generation, so it was not only permanent on the individual, it was permanent on the descendants as well. Now, and again, I'm not going to go into detail because there's all kinds of interesting variations on this, is that what if one of the parents was free and one of the parents was a slave? It was determined then by the mother's status. If the mother was free, so the child was free. And so that remained the case there. And thus, the American importation of slaves was about 800,000. By the Civil War, it was up to 4 million, one of the few slave populations in the world that reproduced itself. But make no mistake about it, the Atlantic slave trade, the growth and expansion of slavery was part and parcel of the age of exploration and was the complete, total, logical extension of the mercantile theory. In a complete, pure business sense. So, you've solved your labor shortage problem here via slavery, and now you have the mercantile theory and the competition among nations. And what results from that is what is collectively known as the Great Wars for Empire. And these great wars for empire were a series of very intense world wars. What globalization also did, besides that Columbian exchange, it took European warfare, which was usually a smaller internal affair, and made it a worldwide affair. And all four of these wars were a world war. The American Revolution turned into a world war, as did the Napoleonic Wars. So World Wars I and II really are World Wars 8 and 9, if you want to count. Or some, so you had the four great wars, the Revolution is 5, Napoleon 6, so they're 7 and 8 in terms of worldwide conflicts. And these four wars occurred within about a 75-year period, and they were major conflicts arising primarily from the English-French competition. And here's the guy that Don't want to do that. No, maybe we will. Yeah, that's just a headshot of him. I wanted to find the famous painting of the Fort Louis. It shows him in his full regalia. Yeah, well, I'll just have to double back. Maybe find it later. Oh, here it is right on the first page. Louis XIV. And here he is. He is the fashion setter. He is the trendsetter for France, for Europe. France, by this time, has become the wealthiest country in the world, at least of the European countries, based on the sugar plantations in Haiti and his fur trading business in Canada. England rules the waves, but France is the wealthier partner in this. And here's Louis again with the extremely long hair, silk stocking, high-heeled shoes, the whole thing. And this, you saw Charles I and Charles II in particular dressed in this high fashion, which was put into play by Louis. He called himself the Sun King. That everybody revolved around him, and his famous quote is "L'État c'est moi," I am the state. And Louis is an absolute monarch, and with absolute monarchy comes the great desire to achieve power. What he does is he basically bullies everyone and becomes extremely autocratic within France. He builds his huge palace, Versailles, and then he forces the nobility to send one of their family to work for him at Versailles, thus squelching any ideas or possibilities about rebelling against Louis. Now, sometimes the 9 Years' War is called the War of the League of Augsburg. Sometimes it's called the War of the Grand Alliance. But basically what Louis wants to do after having consolidated his power inside of France, he now wants to secure the French borders. And so what he proposes to do, I'm looking for a map here. What he proposes to do is to take the borders of France and extend them to the Rhine River. The Rhine River is a broad, fast-flowing river, and if he could get to the Rhine River and make that the border of France, he would be particularly secure. But what the Europeans kind of had come to a consensus on was that they wanted to maintain what they called a balance of power. That the idea was to have two competing alliances that were about equal in power, and therefore decrease the likelihood of war. Well, as you see, it didn't work. And the main reason it didn't work in the first two cases is Louis' desire to expand and increase his power and really become a dominant force, not only in Europe but in the world as well. Long story short, Louis loses the 9 Years' War. Now, the interesting thing is, because these are world wars, they had different names. They had different names in the English colonies than you had in Europe. The 9 Years' War was called King William's War, after the King William and Mary. The War of the Spanish Succession was called Queen Anne's War. The War of the Austrian Succession was King George's War. And the 7 Years' War was the French and Indian War. So, long story short, basically the rest of Europe gangs up on Louis, and Louis loses the 9 Years' War. He really didn't lose much. He had to return back to his old borders, and Europe attempted to return to its previous stature of maintaining a balance of power. Louis, once again, threatens the balance of power. And then this becomes the War of the Spanish Succession. Here, instead of being a invading bully, Louis attempts to pull it off diplomatically. Last 13 years, 1701 to 1714. I'm going to go over here to the document camera a minute. Okay, what I have here on the document camera, this is the map of the Spanish Empire in America at its height. Okay, as you can see, it goes all the way up to practically into Wyoming and Oregon, down through all of the American Southwest, Mexico, Central America, and the entire west coast of South America. So it is huge and very, very lucrative. So what Louis proposes to do, Louis XIV, is the Charles II, the King of Spain, dies without leaving an heir. So what Louis attempts to do is he wants his nephew, Philip, Duke of Anjou, who is married into the Spanish royal family, he wants him to become the King of Spain. So what you would have if this happened is you would have this Spanish Empire, Spain, France itself. Here's another view of the Spanish Empire down here. And then all of this here, the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, the Mississippi River of the French Empire would make, again, France and Louis XIV the preeminent power in the world. And it scared the daylights out of everybody else. And once again, this threatens the balance of power. And now, again, everybody else jumps on and bands together against Louis, and he is defeated. But the wars take place in Europe primarily, but also in America, where it is known as Queen Anne's War. You have it going on in parts of Africa. You have it going on in India. It's truly a worldwide conflict. Didn't want to do that. So the next of these major wars is the War of the Austrian Succession. Now, you can't blame this one on Louis. He's dead and in his grave, but he ruled France for 72 years. Came to the throne when he was 5, regent ruled in his place, but from the time he was in his late teens onward, he was the ruling power in France. But the War of the Austrian Succession is a little bit different, and the result is it's the whole succession. It's one of the problems with monarchies. If you have a stable succession process where you have long-lived, competent rulers, it works out well. But oftentimes, the biological imperatives of the whole thing create a problem. And the problem here was that the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg monarch, was in trouble in that he did not have either any male or competent male heirs, and he determined that his daughter, Maria Theresa, who was, yes, the mother of Marie Antoinette, she had 15 children, I think, and that he got all the great powers that were part of the balance of power to agree that upon his death, they would accept Maria Theresa as the ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire. Well, they did that. They all agreed to that. But as soon as he died, as soon as the Emperor Franz Joseph died, they attacked Maria Theresa. Mostly it was Prussia, but there were a couple other elements that played into it. And of course, England jumps in, France jumps in, and once again you have a major war. Kind of an interesting sidelight. It's called King George's War in America. The Windsors are now there. But the War of Jenkins' Ear, and it's called the War of Jenkins' Ear because of Jenkins' ear. What happened was a British slave trader, was sailing through Spanish territory, Spanish territorial waters, and he was intercepted by the Spanish and interrogated. And the captain very bravely says, or unwisely told, says, "Don't you dare lay a hand on me. My king will make you pay in spades," or words to that effect. The Spanish captain takes out his sword. He chops off the ear of the Captain Jenkins, puts it in a jar of salt water, seals the jar, and then hands it to him and says, "Give this to your king." So besides the attack on Maria Theresa, this attack on this British sea captain in the Caribbean also contributes to the war. Again, in all four of these wars, the French come out on the losing side. They don't lose so much here in this one. I didn't put the S in there very clearly on this Austrian succession, I see. Or the Austrian succession. And this ends up with not a whole lot of change, but ending up with a negative impact for the French. And then the last of these four wars does not start in Europe. The 7 Years' War begins with a young surveyor who's a colonel in the Virginia militia. And he goes out and he's scouting out into the area in the western parts of Virginia. Let me see if I can get a map pulled up here on this computer. Okay, that's much the same as the one I have on the document camera. But you can see here, the French have really expanded their empire here to the in the interior. They kind of have the British pinned up against the side. They've split the Spanish territory of Florida and Texas, Mexico here, apart by their control of New Orleans down here. And this is where the French have a degree of slave labor in Louisiana on sugar plantations, in tobacco farming in that particular area. So the French are a real menace here. And the thing about the French is that because they didn't bring a lot of settlers, they weren't like the British who came to settle permanently and establish their religious beliefs like the Puritans or like the Quakers or like the Catholics in Maryland. They came just simply for profit. And so there was never a great French population, and they made it their business to get along with the Native American population. So during the course of these various wars, the colonies fought not only the French, they also fought Native Americans as they bordered there on the frontier. And for a good century or so, there was strong hostility along that frontier. And it's called the French and Indian War because George Washington, who had land claims here in Ohio, and Washington County is the largest county in Ohio, and yes, he owned a lot of land there. As he was heading out there to survey, he ran into a party of French soldiers, which he attacked and drove off. Well, the next day, that party comes back with reinforcements along with several hundred Native Americans, and Washington goes into a hasty retreat. He built a fort called Fort Necessity, which was quickly captured. And then he and his forces were captured and eventually exchanged. But this triggers a war. And this one goes very differently. As you can look at this, you can see the French have huge advantages in terms of alliances, territory, etc. The only place where the English have any Native American allies in New York, where they have formed an alliance with the Iroquois. The Iroquois were attacked by the French, who were helping out their Algonquin natives supporters, and thus the Iroquois became their enemy, and then when they found out the English hated the French as much as they did, they became allies with the English. So this is a great map in it, because the French and Indian War is going badly here in the Americas. Again, in Europe, the British are doing okay. And then William Pitt, after whom Pittsburgh is named, says this is going to be simple. Instead of us fighting all on the land there, we're going to blockade the St. Lawrence, and we're going to blockade the Mississippi. And they're not going to be able to supply their army, and eventually he proved correct, and the French surrender there in 1763. And so this marks the end of the great wars for empire. And this is the net effect here, is that, when you look on the document camera, the English colonies are now free of any French intervention here. The French are either in Canada, in Quebec, or down here in Louisiana, and the British colonies eagerly anticipate moving on to the west. That doesn't happen for a while, but that's a subject for later on. But my point being is that the mercantile theory spawned these great wars for empire. It also spawned and justified the economic basis of the Atlantic slave trade in it. But like so many things, there's a countervailing or counter influence that comes into play. And this is where I'll end up with you, is the Age of Enlightenment. Here's this little excerpt from that painting I showed you earlier, the School of Athens. This is Aristotle talking to Plato here, theoretically, hypothetically. Or actually, that's Socrates. I take it back. That was Socrates talking to Plato. And the Enlightenment, here's the picture. I realized that wasn't on the computer. Here's that picture I was talking about, Socrates talking to Plato here, from the School of Athens by Raphael. But the Enlightenment is triggered by two things. It is, and I should say it here, is the Enlightenment is the kind of the last final logical conclusion of the Renaissance. Okay, and it's triggered by two things, one political and one academic. Sir Francis Newton and Francis Bacon. We all know what is Newton responsible for. He formulated the law of gravity. And this is how bright this guy was. The mathematics of his day was insufficient to prove it, so he invented a whole new branch of mathematics, calculus, and then after he invented calculus, he mathematically proved the law of gravity. So what Bacon gave us, and we had talked about this before, is he finally formulates what we all know as the scientific method. And so collectively, the Enlightenment is known as the Age of Reason. The idea that is, if you settle down here, if you just get rid of superstition, prejudice, pre-belief, etc., and you use your reason, you can find out the truths that exist in the world. And the scientific method and the formulation of gravity as a natural force kind of give a reason to that. But then you have the glorious revolution. And John Locke, after the revolution is over, settles in, and his position is there are natural rights. Just as there are laws of nature governing science, governing gravity, etc., there are natural laws of nature that are instituted or that exist out there, and that if you use your reason, you're going to figure out these laws of nature, and you're going to come to a logical conclusion. Locke is among the first, actually isn't the first, Hobbes, who uses it in a different way. John Locke comes about and he develops the concept, picture of John Locke here. Okay, this is him obviously in his later days. But what Locke comes up with is the concept of the social contract. And all of these Enlightenment thinkers, they all looked to the Americas, and particularly Native Americans in North America, and they saw them as existing in a state of nature, unfettered by government rules, etc., and observed their behavior, and they said that as you look at it, these people have natural rights. Okay, and these natural rights are your right to life, your right to freedom, to your liberty, and the right to maintain your property. He says, in a state of nature, government is unnecessary. But as people become civilized and live in close proximity to one another, here I have the natural rights, life, liberty, property, that those things are jeopardized. Your life can be in jeopardy, so can your freedom, so can your liberty. And so what is created is government. That government, people give up some of their liberty to government in order to protect their life, liberty, and property. And he says that is the sole function of government. When you think about it reasonably and logically, it's not to have some special divine right king or anything of that nature. The function is to protect people's lives, liberties, and properties. And the glorious revolution, John Locke said, is justified because James II was not protecting the life, liberty, and property of Englishmen. Now, whether that's true or not, lots of Englishmen believe that, and what Locke gave them here in the Enlightenment is the rationale. And this is the age of reason. And historically, it basically goes 1688 to, we'll go 1798. We'll give it a 110-year run. Starts with the Glorious Revolution and ends with the French Revolution. Okay, but the writings of Locke and a couple of the other, and then this is where I'll close up with a couple of these other writers here, come forward. The next guy I want to talk about is Baron de Montesquieu. Baron de Montesquieu, who but the French would put 4 vowels in a row, U-I-V-U. And Montesquieu said, yeah, you're right, John Locke, but we got a problem. Is And Rousseau, another Enlightenment writer, says, yes, man is born free, but he is everywhere in chains. And Montesquieu said, yeah, we got to have government, but how do we stop governments from doing what they seem to be doing, taking away our natural rights? We institute these governments to protect our natural rights. Why in the world do those natural rights disappear and we have all these divine right monarchs and tyrants all over the place? And he did a study of government and he wrote a book about it, Spirit of Laws. And after studying government, he said, I've looked at all kinds and I've come to the conclusion that the English government is the best. And their governance that they have set up in their colonies as well. And in Spirit of Laws, he is the champion of separation of powers. Okay? And he said in England, you have the king. You have parliament. And you have courts. The parliament makes the laws, the king is in charge of enforcing the laws, and the courts interpret the laws. This is called separation of powers. He said this works best because now no branch of government has too much power. And he observed the way the British government organized and ran itself, the way the British American colonies ran themselves, and he concluded that this separation of powers should be the way governments are organized across the board. And when you move forward from Locke, we'll finally come to Thomas Jefferson. What does Jefferson write? Of course, we all know. He writes the Declaration of Independence. And in the Declaration of Independence, he begins, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That is, in other words, they are obvious to anybody who is alive and breathing, that all men are created equal. Okay? This is the dynamite phrase, that all men are created equal. So clearly, what does the Enlightenment challenge? The Enlightenment challenges the institution of slavery. And the anti-slavery movement begins at the beginning of the Age of Reason and persists throughout the early 19th century to, by the mid-19th century, it's virtually gone everywhere in the world and finally gone legally from Brazil in 1890. So it's a 200-year battle about this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and here he paraphrases Locke, life, liberty, and he doesn't say property, he says pursuit of happiness. And that broadens that whole scope of rights, in that it's ingenious in that it says you don't only have three rights. You have life, liberty for sure, but you also have the right to pursue happiness, which means you can do whatever you want to do practically as long as you're not in violation of necessarily laws. And that to protect these rights, governments are instituted among men. So again, he reiterates Locke that the purpose of government is to protect your natural rights. And when the government becomes destructive of those ends, protecting your natural rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish that government. Boom, radical stuff, all in a couple sentences. And the Declaration of Independence, that little preamble part there, is one of the most dramatic applications of the concepts of the Enlightenment anywhere in the world. And of course, it continues because slavery is not abolished. That dichotomy that began in 1619 between the freedom of self-governance and the institution of slavery simultaneous to it, and ending up with long-term problems for the United States. And then That's 1776. And then 11 years later, the U.S. Constitution is written, implementing and put together in the way that Montesquieu recommended. That you have a Congress that makes laws, a president whose job is to enforce those laws, and a court that is in charge of interpreting those laws. So their solution to the problem of government power is to divide government power as much as they can. And the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution are probably the high points here of the Age of Reason in terms of that. It ends, unfortunately, the Age of Reason with the French Revolution, the French attempt to replicate the philosophy of the American Revolution. They go wild. They end up beheading the king and queen, and they start beheading each other, and they end up with a dictator named Napoleon. And so the Age of Reason kind of comes crashing down at the end there. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with here, this will be the last thing we talk about here today, and that is the evolution, and I'm not going to talk about it real long. Okay, this is kind of the twin brother, or twin sister, if you will, of American democracy, and that is capitalism. It's an economic system based on private ownership, means of production and their operation for profit, characteristics, private property, capital accumulation, wage labor, voluntary exchange, price system, and this very, very, very important last point here, competitive markets. In other words, the opposite of America's favorite board game, Monopoly. The enlightenment scholar who came up with this idea is Adam Smith, and his book was Wealth of Nations. And it is the founding document of capitalism, and ironically, he wrote it 1776, the same year in which Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. When he wrote Wealth of Nations, and again, he did it in the same way, the same manner that the political thinkers operated. He used reason, logic, science to the extent that he could in trying to find laws that governed economics. And the first thing he wanted to get rid of was mercantilism, because mercantilism was a very strictly government-regulated affair where people in government benefited highly from it, and a few chosen select people who were in league with the government were able to make and reap large profits from it. And so one of his positions of capitalism was the idea of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means very little government involvement. Did he want no government involvement? No. But he wanted to do away with the concepts of mercantilism, where the government highly regulated who could trade with whom, tried to set up rules to ensure favorable balance of trade, and all those sorts of things. Smith said, leave people alone, in a democratic sense, and allow them to compete. And his famous example was bakers. He said, there are hundreds of bakers in London. Which bakers are the most successful? Not the baker with the best bread, because that tends to be more expensive, and not the baker with the worst bread, the cheapest bread, because that sometimes doesn't quite taste so good. And he said the best, most profitable baker is the baker who makes the best bread for the best price. And he felt that competition among businesses forced them to get better, to refine their products, their methods, etc., and produce the best product at the best price. Again, this is his theoretical model for capitalism, and really, more or less, is kind of the thought process that still exists today. And the big debate is, what does the government, what is the role of the government, which here is little? What does the government do when there is monopoly or collusion or an oligopoly, where there is either only one company or all the companies are in collusion with one another, like OPEC? Clearly, we don't have any control over that, but that's clear collusion there. Or an oligopoly, where you got a handful of companies that can control everything. And now you run into the problem is, okay, if competition results in monopoly, should the government step in and regulate that monopoly? And that is the ongoing question there. But democracy and capitalism come out of this, come out of the Reformation period, and it comes out of this age of reason that evolves here late in the 17th and the early 18th century. So I think that's going to wrap us up for today and probably for the semester. Hopefully I don't have to come back and do one of these things. This is like January 3rd, and I've done all of these between like the middle of December and now. So hopefully I don't have to do any more, but if I do, I'll be more than glad to do that. And I'll probably, well, you won't see this till the end of the period, end of the semester, so it doesn't matter. I'll probably be coming in on January 17th to see you. So with that, I will sign off and stop.